Hi, welcome to lecture 5 in Soccer 366. And I'll be talking here about the way that nature is incorporated into consumer culture and the way that nature itself can be seen as being commodified. So I think I wanted to start by just kind of using this image as a way of thinking about that. It's a fairly common thing to see in the streets of Newcastle where trees are kind of shaped to allow power lines through them. So I think this is a nice kind of illustration of our relation between nature and culture. Nature throughout the last couple of centuries in particular, and particularly in the rise of capitalism, has been seen as something that needs to be dominated by humans. It needs to be something that's like held back. It's threatening. We know that we kind of rely on it, in terms of air and food and water, but really it's something to be used as a resource, something to be shaped, so we can kind of get on with our lives. Of course, that's something that needs to be constantly worked at. So in this example, for instance, that tree, if left to its own devices, would very quickly swallow that power line and, bring the poles down around it after a year or two. So I think that's a nice little metaphor, really, for the constant work and that humans feel that they need to do to hold nature back from a threat, but also the ways that it's kind of unsustainable, that really it's not something we can keep doing. So the content this week, and I think the reading is particularly good this week in terms of thinking about the ways that nature itself has been brought into consumer culture. And the ways that humans have tried to separate themselves in many ways from nature, to the point where some theorists argue that it doesn't really exist anymore, and if it does exist, it's going to kind of come back in the end, and maybe nature will exist and humans won't. So certainly nature has been seen as something, to be used, extraction of fossil fuels and trees, modification of environments for farming and building and all this kind of stuff. I think a really good example of the ways that we don't really deal with nature in a kind of actual reality is the ways that much of the effects of our economy are an externality in terms of the way that economics deals with it. They're not really considered on balance sheets. It's not really considered very much on balance sheets at all. So thinking here about the very kind of social and cultural implications of the way that nature has been separated from those things, and the way that that's, not very useful and very unsustainable. But the way that kind of culture itself becomes embedded in the ways that we relate to nature. And a kind of a silly example that I use there, it's kind of, I think for many people, it's almost impossible to think about sharks without hearing the Jaws music. Our relation to, an example of nature there, sharks in the ocean, becomes represented and felt and experienced. The sensation of it can be kind of associated with a particular form of music and pop culture. So even here in this week's work, we're looking at the ways that, the kind of need to get back to nature, whether it's kind of going to the beach or going camping in the middle of nowhere, may actually kind of reflect humans' rather arrogant and separate relation to it, rather than even a more authentic experience or a more kind of or a less problematic relation to nature. So that's the kind of stuff we're going to be looking at this week. So the chapter this week, I think, does a really good job of thinking about how nature is something now that's consumed, and particularly through the notion of tourism, through pre-packaged theme parks in particular, nature-based tourism. But we can think of this in all kinds of other ways, and even what seem to be more mundane ways. I mean, if you go out into the bush or you go to any kind of natural environment area now to kind of look at something, there tends to be human-made platforms for you to stand on and view it. So that in and of itself is, I think, a good example of how nature is something to be viewed through a particular lens. So it relies upon the distinction between the simulation of nature and an apparent authentic experience of nature. But the idea of authenticity itself here is problematic. It's very increasingly rare for us to be able to engage in kind of natural environment in ways that kind of escape these kind of mediated and commodified forms. So the chapter looks at the gaze, the fetishization of nature, and here we're kind of thinking about the notion of the tourist gaze, the zoological gaze. Nature becomes a thing to be consumed from a kind of particular perspective. Themed nature parks, places like SeaWorld, essentially McDonaldise and Disneyise nature into idealised spaces. Nature becomes a form of spectacle, a form of simulation, and is virtualised. So here those kind of places are like basically shopping centres with animals in them. And then we can look at the notion of tourism. People that kind of want to have more authentic experiences are also kind of packaged up for us. And they engage with our desire, that romantic ideal of being in nature. And what happens in those situations, that kind of post-tourist situation, is there's a confrontation between the tensions between authenticity and that mediation that I've been talking about. So to begin with, the gaze, the notion of the tourist gaze in particular, created by John Ury, has been really influential from a sociological perspective to think about the ways that we engage with being a tourist and more specifically, the relation between humans and the way that we experience nature. Now, the notion of the gaze itself as a kind of common sociological way of thinking. John Berger's work, as I pointed out already in the course, has been foundational in this area. He kind of uses some Marxist philosophy in particular and semiotics to think about the ideological ways that modern art, the ideologies that modern art promotes. More broadly, the gaze has been used to kind of think about the male gaze and the patriarchal gaze. The Bechdel test, I think, is a good example of a kind of everyday popular cultural example. There's been the medical gaze through Foucauldian research, the separation of doctors and patients. And certainly the imperial gaze from Kaplan there that shows that emphasises the various ethnocentric hierarchies that are still in relation in terms of post-colonial global relations in particular. So the gaze has been really important here. But in terms of the fetishization of nature, the tourist gaze has been a way developed by John Ury to think about this. So here people become travellers or tourists, and when we're doing that, we're kind of experiencing and seeking stuff outside of our normal day-to-day lives. You know, we're off on a holiday here, taking a break from our job, or the weekend at least, you know, getting away from what we do in that Monday, Friday world. This kind of notion of getting away, of experiencing new sounds and sights and foods and smells. So in a way, that very kind of orientation, that I move away from work and try and, in some ways, moving outside of consumer culture in that everyday sense, sets up a kind of orientation, a way of viewing things that Ury starts to postulate as this idea of the tourist gaze. The gaze, after all, is visual. It can literally take a split second, and the other services provided are, in a sense, peripheral to the fundamental processes of consumption, which is the capturing of the gaze itself. So, just as a little sidetrack here, John Ury's work has been very influential. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. His work is across a number of fields. Certainly, he's very well known for the tourist gaze. He also wrote some really important theoretical texts in the 90s around the kind of changes to capitalism, really in the same vein as kind of Beck's work on Risk Society and Castell's on the Information Age. Ury and Scott Lash wrote these books called The End of Organised Capitalism and Economies of Science of Space. He also has been a key in the kind of rise of understanding of mobility. He's seen as a kind of key theorist in mobility studies. He also wrote a really good little book about bringing complexity theory into social theory, which is, I think, well worth checking out. And his later work on climate change in society, about how sociology itself is kind of struggling to deal with the problem of climate change, where he's kind of sketched out what he called a post-carbon sociology, is a really good book as well. One of the good things about John Ury's work, particularly the stuff on mobilities, complexity and climate change there, again, they're very readable texts. So I think if you're interested in those topics, you should check those out. So when it comes to sketching out this tourist gaze, Ury kind of highlights how there's a political economy of it. The gaze tends to be performed by relatively wealthy people from the so-called first world on the rest. And this combines a kind of conspicuous form of consumption, but also kind of a spectacular notion of consumption where we kind of going out into this world trying to kind of, I suppose, collect experiences of kind of, spectacle. So I think the quote there kind of sums up that quite well. What Ari has to say about this is places are chosen to be gazed upon because there is anticipation, especially through daydreaming and fantasy in our day-to-day lives, of intense pleasures, either on a different scale or involving different senses from those customarily experienced, again, in our day-to-day work lives in particular. That anticipation is constructed and sustained through a variety of non-tourist practices, such as film, TV, literature, magazines, records, and videos, which construct and reinforce that gaze. So importantly here, what Ari is pointing out is that we kind of bring the experience of the places that we're going to, the way that we've learnt about these places through books, magazine, films, and TV. We bring those expectations, when we become a tourist. But then what often happens is the tourist industry kind of frames our experience of those places through those preconceptions as well to make them more palatable for us. This involves processes of fetishization, fantasy, mediation, representation. So it kind of brings together here those romantic and collective gazes that they are past and present brings together. So I'll just, that's how I want to end that here. The idea of the tourist gaze is a way of thinking of how tourism itself is an experience that we crave in terms of getting new experiences, of experiencing things that are beyond our day-to-day lives. But what happens in this relationship is that we tend to bring a fairly colonial, dominant way of being in the world. You'll often see, tourists in other countries, complaining about the food and the smells and all that kind of stuff. And as a result of that, what often happens as well is that there becomes an industry in those places to provide experiences to those Western tourists that kind of take some of those cultural edges off that maybe we find obscene or abject or disgusting, and package things up for us so we can experience them more easily and efficiently. And that's what the second half of the content today is about.